Manhattan Stardust, Chapter 3. The opera, s'il vous plaît. Gary, can you do me a favor? Where had I heard that one before? Well, at least it wasn't my father. It was Jasper, who had done me a favor that was like a backhanded compliment that ended up being the real thing. So I was grateful, and I owed him one. And in this case, I wasn't going to quibble and ask what he was asking for before agreeing. The way I look at it, a favor wouldn't be a favor unless it jeopardized your bionage, no matter how innocent it might appear. I just gave my consent at the outset and left the particulars to a later date. Sure, I replied without hesitation. Shoot. Not over the phone. He's here. Who? Emilio. Who else? So it's not something I can talk about. And then Jasper's voice pitched up a few notches in a cheery sort of way. Is it true Jennifer's going for that part off Broadway? That's fantastic. What part? Jasper was back to the hushed tone again. Meet me at Tio Pepe's at 11 tomorrow. Emilio sleeps in on Sundays, and I can sneak out for a while as long as I'm back before 3. That was marriage for you. The cavalier Jasper of yore, who roamed hither and thither regardless of the hour or the disapproving eye, had vanished. It was beginning to seem as bad as when he turned Philadelphian for a while. But a friend was a friend, and he and I had been friends and not friends and friends again a few times round, so I agreed to the rendezvous in the village. I felt for the guy. And although I counted on something outlandish in the favor department, I'd had a trump up my sleeve, which was to help the man figure out an alternative once I had declined. And I had no doubt I would decline, because I had no doubt that whatever Jasper would request would be much too much, and I'd actually be doing him a favor by not involving myself, which is exactly what Jennifer and Miranda said when I asked their permission to hear him out. And by not involving myself, he would think twice and move on to something hopefully less harebrained. You see, Jasper was a serial enthusiast, the kind of guy who, when seized by an idea, seized everyone else in sight to pursue it, and generally left a wreckage in its wake as bad as Hurricane Sabrina's. Haiku, theater, Bavarian-style string trios, Kafka-inspired musical comedy, cat women, communist free speech. The wake was long. Jasper was a bit twitchy at Tio Pepe's, and it took half a bottle of habanero sauce smothered over a Mexican omelet to relax the man the way I figured a sweat lodge would calm down a Navajo. Jasper was dripping, sopping wet, but at least he could get to the nub finally, and by the third margarita lay bare the breast and open up the soul. Gary, he began, mopping the brow with the 30th napkin, some people are born a certain way, if you know what I mean, and others kind of become that way, you know, after they're born. He gazed at me, and I'm one of those others. He gazed some more. Okay, I replied, but I'm not sure anymore. And after he signaled to the waiter and had started in on his 4th breakfast drink, he continued, to be honest, I'd had a few hunches all along, but hunches aren't necessarily anything more than hunches, so I just listened. Gary, for Emilio, it's genetic, but for me, it's an acquired trait, nurture over nature. Now, I'm no expert in Darwinism, but I was getting his drift, and I nodded sympathetically. I never thought you were a natural South Pole, Jasp. What do you mean? It's okay, buddy. You can spill the beans, I replied, noticing that he had mopped up the beans on his plate, which he'd also drenched in hot sauce before he tackled the eggs. Survival of the fittest. What? Come on, Jasper, there are plenty of girls out there. And there were several attractive specimens at Tio Pepe's who glanced our way now and then. I darted the eyes sideways in their direction without moving my head, and I was on the verge of winking, but I caught myself, thank God. He just looked at me. Who said anything about girls? I'm talking about the opera. And he went on to talk at length about how he'd come to question his feelings about the musical genre that had drawn him to his second wife, Maria Tolomeo, who had, incidentally, quite a set of pipes, and then turned him over to his next and current marital partner, Emilio, more connoisseur than chanteuse. Actually, an instrumentalist, if anything. It's not the music, Gary. It's the people, the whole damned world of bickering clacks and fusspots and jewelry and mouths and costumes and egos. And Emilio is right at home with the crowd. He can't live without it and them, and I'm at the point. And Jasper went on at length to describe the opera set in some detail. He could deal, he said, with the brainless tenors, devious divas, and bulked-up baritones whose vocal wobbles turned the cushioned seats at the Met into massage chairs. He could manage the incomprehensibly contorted plots, the consumptive prostitutes with hearts of gold, and the scheming villainy that was as subtle as a politician's smile. He could even endure the 5-hour Wagnerian comedies. But what he couldn't take were the so-called opera lovers themselves. The opera lovers, he said in higher pitches, who hardly loved anything about opera at all except for their own few personal favorites. The opera lovers, he continued with an increase of decibels, who loved nothing better than to argue about vibrato. Fortunately, management came over to the table to ask if anything was wrong, which finally shut Jasper up. And when he looked at his watch, he realized he had 2 minutes to catch the subway to get back to Queens before Emilio awoke. Then he bolted out of the restaurant like a soprano in search of applause. And the favor? I guessed it was my having to pay the pre-feast brunch bill that had been unfixed and padded by Jasper's thirst. Well, as I've said before, I couldn't begrudge the guy, and as favors went, this was so simple it nearly amounted to a non-favor after all. But just as I was settling accounts and getting that good deed vibration from an act of selflessness, who should breeze into the premises but Dad? And Dad and his scarf and beret and fancy French shoes, and the fancy French siren who was making him so happy these days, Geneviève. I didn't begrudge my father his newfound happiness. I just winced a little at his wholesale conversion to Frenchification, and I kept the lids lowered when Geneviève smiled and turned her reproachful and scintillating blue eyes in my direction. I suppose they were worth it for Dad, and for her part, she kept him away from Belmont and kept his finances in the black for the first time in forever. Dad never had much trouble making money. It's just that spending, if you call losing it in cartfuls at the racetrack spending, was even less difficult. So with Geneviève came a new regime of household stability, as well as the bonne chance of les petits mots and things I could barely manage to imagine for a man of his age, especially for my father. A few more margaritas, however, eased the tension, and I unburdened myself of the Jasper dilemma. "But he seemed to adore Carmen," Geneviève exclaimed. And then Geneviève looked at Dad and frowned, and the tears welled up a bit, and she pleaded with me to tell my dad to come clean with Sabrina about the nuptials. "He's ashamed of our marriage, Gary, and he's ashamed of me," she sobbed in that French accent of hers, which made me want to give her a hug. "S'il vous plaît." But Dad gave her a hug instead, and she shook him off frostily and pleaded with me again to plead on her behalf before excusing herself to powder her nose, an aquiline one that turned up slightly at its end and made it that much easier for a meeting of lips. So I went to bat for her. "Come on, Dad, you have to let Sabrina know eventually." "Not necessarily." "Mom knows. It's only a matter of time before they stop not speaking. Is that how you want it?" "Not exactly," he stammered, and I knew I'd hit a soft spot. Touché. Dad began fiddling with his new earring, and when Geneviève returned from the powder room, he promised her that he would think about it. The now delighted and exuberantly grateful Geneviève leapt to thank me with an embrace, and I got myself out of Tio Pepe's faster than Jasper. Just as I'd hit 80th Street, pretty pleased with myself for how I had handled the favors and the escapes, Jasper rang. Amelia was still sleeping off a night of socialist editing. The Wobblies' broadsheets came out on Sunday morning, so Jasper could still speak relatively freely as long as he kept a healthy distance inside their cramped flat. "I forgot to ask that little favor, Gary." "You mean aside from brunch?" "Don't worry, I'll take care of you. Yes, aside from brunch. It'll be no skin off your back. All I want is for you to come with me to the Met next week. My treat." "I'm not really an opera kind of guy, Jasper." "I know you're not, and that's exactly what I need because I don't know if I'm really an opera guy or not. And that's exactly what I need to find out without Emilio, who is an opera guy, clouding my judgment." "Is that really it?" "That's really it." I couldn't say I really got it, and I was fully prepared to filibuster until Jasper said one word more, and he said it in a way I couldn't refuse. "Come on." So I said okay. The program summary of the so-called plot was quite a piece of work, what with witches, troubadours, princesses, counts, infants consigned to flames or switched around at birth, and I can't tell how long I was asleep, but I know I woke up when Jasper shot an elbow to my side and a bunch of smithies were hammering away, and, this being opera, singing at a deafening full tilt. Jasper was riveted and pointed to one of the chorus gals whose gypsy costume brought out the best of her. "Look," he urged with urgency. And I looked, and I kept on looking. There was no mistake. There were the hills of Golgotha, and there was Maria Tolomeo belting it out with the rest of the crowd. But after she and her twin peaks had exited stage right, I must have dozed off again, because when I awoke, at Jasper's urging, the evening's mayhem was over, and my friend made a beeline for the green room. I waited outside watching the Lincoln Center fountain gush, but it wasn't long before Jasper joined me. He looked like he'd been slapped in the face, and as it turned out he had, and a stream of nonsense poured and spluttered out of him. "Did you see her? She did it! She actually shook herself free from that overly possessive creep of a father to become herself, an artist, Gary. The duende was in full flow. Her duende, not yours. The real thing. What did I tell you?" 30 more minutes of excited gibberish went by, and any run-of-the-mill auteur loaded with visual and philosophical irony would have salivated for the chance to frame my friend as he spouted the stuff while the fountain did its thing in the background. It would be the kind of shot to make disheveled academics teaching French cinema at community colleges around the world drool. I didn't yell "cut," but I did gently interrupt Jasper's flow to reel him in and get him back to the raison d'etre of my favor. Was he, or was he not, an opera guy? "It's not about the opera, Gary. It's about something deeper." "Girls? No, not girls. Is that all you can think about? No, Gary. It's about art." "What about it?" "What about it?" Jasper sounded as if he wanted to sound incredulous, but I knew him better. "Well, yeah, what about it? What about art? What about the art of opera or the art of the opera? What are you talking about?" Jasper put his arm around my shoulders and led me away from the fountain and sized me up and looked me in the eye and said with an incredibly straight face, "It's about the art of Maria Tolomeo, my former wife. It's about what Maria Tolomeo has finally become, an artist." I suppose, loosely speaking, one might refer to every member of the 1,000-strong chorus at the Met as an artist, but I struggled to follow the unfolding thread until he added, "And it's about me and what I really am, and what Maria will be once again, with a little bit of luck and a small favor from my very best friend." I noticed the word favor preceded by the word small, and I noticed the omission of Jasper's cat and opera-loving marital colleague Emilio. You might say I was a strong listener to notice such things. Maybe you're right. And maybe I was an even stronger listener to wonder about the fine distinctions between threads that unfolded and threads that unraveled dangerously. But when I dropped Jasper off at the subway, I was weak in the knees. I think it's moot to ask whether what I did was give Maria Tolomeo short shrift or not give her her due, because either way it amounted pretty much to the same thing. As impromptu best man at her impromptu and expeditiously arranged wedding to Jasper in the law offices of Shapiro, Hartman, Isaacs, Tolomeo, and Epstein in Philadelphia, there wasn't much chance for depth. Now, however, there was. At first, I have to admit I was skeptical. Skeptical and a little uneasy in the conscience department. Jasper, after having been slapped by Maria in the green room and told in very clear and stentorian tones, even by operatic standards, that she never, ever, not in her life wanted to see or hear from him ever again, well, that's when Jasper started gushing out at the fountain about art, and when he called me later to bring me into the fold, or breach, just one more time. All he wanted me to do was try to see whether I myself might soften Maria up a bit, that is, to act as his emissary and, over a few coffees or drinks or strolls, to slip her a few haikus on his behalf, just so he could have a face-to-face. One more chance, that sort of thing. What about Emilio? My conscience replied. Gary, Jasper sighed. I love the guy, but, well, to be perfectly frank, he's no artist. Let me leave it at that. And besides, if it's meant to be, just don't breathe a word at the Seraglio. I could see his point. Miranda, being a dear, close friend of Emilio's, not to mention a co-worker who had to lay eyes on him daily, might not have understood. Nor Jennifer, who also liked the guy and had been advising him and Jasper about investing their spare change in socially conscious capitalistic hedge funds. But I liked the guy too, so I demurred. Jasper, I don't think I'm the man for the job. Gary. Jasper. Gary. Jasper. Please. So I agreed. But I only agreed because I knew his plan had as much chance of surviving as a steamed mussel in Mr. Tolomeo's mouth. And, as it turned out, I was dead right, but for all the wrong reasons. The only downside was having to go to the Met twice a week and endure the shows. Why can't I just head straight to the green room or the stage door without actually sitting through the whole damn fiasco? It won't be genuine, buddy. You've got to be in the moment. You've got to soak up the ambience. You've got to live the part. Otherwise, she'll sniff you out. Believe me, she's extremely sensitive. You've got to win her over and influence her to win her over to me. Anyway, Bohem's the next one up, a crowd pleaser. Make sure you're awake for Act 2. The line for the green room was so long that I decided to trundle down to the stage exit or entrance, depending on your perspective. Instead, loaded with misgivings, but willing to give it a try, and swearing to myself that one strike would be enough to strike out, and that would be that, and Jasper would just have to face up to the verismo of his currently married life, period. After an infinity, the warblers finally started to drift out. I spotted Maria, who was hard to miss, and coughed and gave a little wave, and I did that thing with my chin that Jasper insisted on, and sure enough, she bit. Gary? Yeah. What are you doing here? Did you see the show? You were swell, Maria. And then she blushed, and we agreed to nip round to an Irish pub in the vicinity where we began a bit of a parler de tout et de rien, just as Jasper had advised. I had no idea you were an opera buff, Gary. That's wonderful. Well, I replied, getting ready for the frontal assault, slipping in a bon mot about Jasper. But she headed me off at the pass, unlike that former husband of mine whose name I won't even mention. But I'll hand it to you. You were a pretty cool best man for an arranged marriage. And she began to laugh, and I joined in because, in all honesty, there was a lot of humor in the situation. And there was a lot more to Maria than Golgotha, and before long it was long after midnight, and I had agreed to return in 2 nights with a comp. Jasper buzzed me at lunch the next day, and I gave my report, and then he came round to give me another haiku. I just didn't have the heart to tell him that Maria had cleansed him out of her heart so thoroughly that she was spotless. But I gave him hope. And the funny thing was that little by little over the next month, I began to stay awake, and I then began to look forward to the next installment, and somehow the world of opera began to grow on me. And everybody was happy, mostly. Jasper felt like Wellington at Waterloo, the way he went on about his strategy, and Miranda and Jennifer were thrilled by my fervor for a culture that combined 2 of their own passions, music and theater, and Emilio certainly had Jasper all to himself for the time being at least. I began to look forward even more especially to the little drinks and strolls with Maria, especially after the matinee performances on weekends, where the long afternoon stretched into a long night as she filled me in on law school, Philadelphia, and life in the opera world. Do you know what it's like being around a bunch of knife-throwing, backstabbing, conniving bastards? Well, my dad's a lawyer and he's told me a little about what goes on. I'm talking about the chorus. They make lawyers seem like, what's that lovely phrase you quoted the other day? It was so gorgeous about the young-eyed cherubins? Yes! Opera singers, even the small fry, make lawyers, Philadelphia lawyers, look like cherubins. That was saying something. Then again, the operas themselves were full of the stuff. I guess it would begin to wear off on you. Gary, she continued, would you do me a small favor? Would you recite those lines again? At lower decibels, over a glass of wine in a cozy restaurant, Maria's voice had the quality of angels, and it was more than the lawyer or opera singer in her. So I recited those lines about the moonlight and the sounds of music and soft stillness and the night until the touches of sweet harmony became Maria's lips. Jasper, on the out-of-sight sidelines, was growing restless. A month ago, he was content to take the patient Kutuzov approach as a battlefield commandant, but now it was more like Marat straining at the bit to lead a charge. Speaking of Jasper, well, that's just it. It was impossible to speak of him or about him in Maria's presence, and there was nothing I could do about it. His haikus had gathered dust in my pocket like a feline hairball, so I simply tossed them out. And as for Miranda and Jennifer, I didn't speak much about them either, aside from mentioning that we were flatmates, which was completely true. You see, the thing about opera singers, which I hadn't fully realized before, is that their talent for drama extended offstage as well. Eating a pretzel with Maria became an event, whereas with Jennifer and Miranda, more often than not, pretzels were simply pretzels, and that whole give and take with the pretzel vendor lacked luster. For Maria Tolomeo, nearly everything had the potential for ecstasy or fiery conflict, like habanero sauce, in fact, now that I think about it. She added spice. A squirrel was never just a glorified rat with his mind set on grabbing a nut in the park. For Maria, he or she was involved in an intricate conspiratorial dance with dogs, birds, lesser rats, and genuine people. And speaking of people and the looks that came our way, whether it was because of how she threw on a scarf or loosened her blouse, well, looks had a kind of intrigue, dirty or not. But best of all was that she saw the swashbuckling side of my work. Accounting, she whispered with her eyelashes touching mine, isn't just arithmetic, Gary. It's about settling accounts. When I groomed myself in the mirror before the next matinee, which would be followed by a horse and carriage ride around Central Park, I saw a guy who was fast approaching another moment of truth, and the kind of truth not really understood from an outsider's perspective, like Jasper's or Miranda's or Jennifer's. Luckily, Jasper would be sweating it out in Queens, and Miranda and Jennifer would be visiting Jennifer's hippie parents in Ithaca for the weekend. I just figured that fate would have its say, as it always does in my experience. They do this in Philadelphia, Gary, said Maria as we trotted through the trees under the moonlight, but it's not the same. I can imagine, I dreamily replied. The air was warm and there were fragrances bustling about, and Maria's charms couldn't have been more charmant. And then fate knocked, or rather came down like a hammer in Verdi's Anvil chorus, twice. The first was when Maria and I, having dismounted, somehow fell into and around each other right in the middle of Columbus Circle, prepared to stay that way for several hours or until the police arrived. The second was when a French voice filtered through the stimulus barrier of our passionate kisses, followed by the French person of Geneviève, dressed in summertime garb and looking every bit the 27-year-old ideal that daily yoga kept in shape. Geneviève made it very clear that I was no stranger to her, and then Maria Tolomeo made it very clear that she was operatic, and after I had separated the women, Maria told me in no uncertain terms, and with the volume befitting an onstage principal rather than choral singer, to go the way of Jasper. By the time Dad had huffed into view with his scarf and beret, Maria was already speeding off in a cab. He brushed down his wife's diaphanous raiment, somewhat quizzically, and then gave me the news. Sabrina had been informed. And, Dad said, she said she hoped I was happy. How do you like that? No scene. What do you think? What a girl your sister is. I knew she'd come around. Geneviève, smiling dangerously, embraced me with a merci, and I embraced her back in awe of her dextérité. And when she inquired in a French I could easily understand about Jennifer and Miranda, I whispered an imploring, s'il vous plaît. She winked reassuringly, and then told my father what an adorable son he had. The next day, when the girls returned from Ithaca laden with books and a vintage white Nehru jacket from the late 60s that fit me perfectly, I breathed a sigh of relief and thanked my lucky French stars. And when Jasper called for an update, I gave him the goods fair and square. The essence, that is, which was the truth, that as far as Maria was concerned, he was persona non grata in perpetuity. He took it on the chin like a man and eventually moved on to another enthusiasm, while Emilio, none the wiser, kept the catnip flowing. And as for opera, come on, or as Geneviève might say, s'il vous plaît.